Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on mistakes in error correction in speaking. This webinar will give you an overview of the theoretical part on mistakes and errors, as well as equip you with the practical skills to help your students identify their most common mistakes and eradicate them from their speaking. My name is Magdalena, and I've been a teacher for Skyeng for about 3 years now, and I've also recently joined the Teacher Training Center. I have a master's and a bachelor's degree in methodology of teaching English, and I'm also a TEFL certified teacher. So let's get started. As you know, correction is a complex and multifaceted process, and it requires a lot of attention. So before we get a better understanding and a better grasp of the correction techniques, we have to go through several theoretical aspects. So on our agenda today, we will take a look at the differences between errors and mistakes. Then we will move on to identifying the sources of mistakes and learn where do mistakes come from. In the main part of this presentation, we will be talking about the types of speaking activities we engage our students in, as well as how to show incorrectness or how to correct. At the very end of this presentation, we will summarize the main points. So let's start with a question. Should mistakes in speaking be corrected? What do you think? I think all of us would agree that yes, mistakes in speaking should be corrected. Mistakes are a vital part of the learning process in a way that they do not only show our students areas for improvement, but with correction, we actually let students understand what is right and what is wrong. You know that the ultimate goal of learning a language is the ability to speak it fluently and accurately. So with correction, we're actually working on improving our students' fluency and accuracy. Now, our next question. Who should correct students' mistakes? Should it be the teacher alone or should it be the student? Well, the ideal scenario is that the student correct his or her mistakes. And however, our role as a teacher is very subtle, or let's say very passive. Our role there is to, first of all, signal that a student has just made a mistake, then help the student identify the mistake and self-correct it. The more we engage the student into the correction process, the better effect it will have on the long run. Now, as I said, in order to understand how correction works and which strategies and approaches to use, we need to first of all understand the difference between errors and mistakes. I'm sure that you've heard these two different terms. Now, let's learn the details. What is an error? An error is a deviation made by learners who actually have lack of knowledge of the correct rule of the target language. This means that you hadn't taught this a certain grammar structure to your students yet. A learner can hardly ever self-correct an error because, as I said, we're dealing with a grammatical or target language that we had not taught before. On the contrary, a mistake is a deviation in speaker's language that occurs when the speakers, although familiar with the rule, they just fail to perform to their competence. This means that you have previously taught a certain grammar structure or a construction, but due to some external or non-linguistic factors, students make mistake. It can be because they're careless during lessons. It could be due to lack of concentration. They're maybe exhausted, so that's why they make mistakes. In most cases, when you point out the mistake, the learner would be able to self-correct it. So that's the major difference between errors and mistakes. Now, you probably have heard the term slip also. Well, a slip is a type of mistake. And it occurs because the student is maybe speaking too fast. And of course, they're bound to make a slip. We all make mistakes. We all make slips, even us teachers. Now, some of the teachers' main dilemmas when it comes to correction is what to correct, errors mistakes or slips, and how much of a correction to do in a lesson. Let's find out the answers. First of all, linguists agree that we should ignore errors. Why? Well, as I said already, errors occur due to material which haven't been taught before. That's why don't overwhelm your students with introducing new target language or structures in order not to overwhelm your student. Maybe your student isn't ready for that part yet. Imagine a pre-intermediate student trying to use a third conditional. Of course, at pre-intermediate, we don't teach the rules of the third conditional because it's too complex for them to grasp and understand. That's why they're not at that level yet, and ignore the errors. Just don't pay attention to it until you have explicitly taught the rules. So you're probably wondering what to correct then. Well, focus on mistakes, but it is virtually impossible to correct all mistakes a student make. That's why we have a criteria. So first of all, focus on those recurring mistakes, those mistakes that occur with the highest frequency. Number two, focus on mistakes which impede communication. So you don't understand what your student is trying to tell you. This could be a pronunciation mistake. This could be a vocabulary mistake or mistake in the word order. Again, this interferes with you understanding the meaning of the sentence. And number three, focus on correcting mistakes whose rules you have studied prior. So don't focus on those mistakes which you have studied a long time ago, but on those structures that you have recently studied with your student. And the next question is, how much of a correction to do? Again, don't overwhelm your student with too much correction because this might intimidate the student or discourage the student from speaking further. That's why it is very important to find a balance between interaction or speaking and correction. Ideally, you should not correct more than 6 mistakes at a time or per speaking activity. Again, follow these criteria above and make sure that you do not focus on too many mistakes. Now, moving on to the next part is understanding or identifying why do mistakes happen and where do they come from. Let's take a closer look at some examples from my students' speech. A lot of them say informations, advices, or luggages. One of my students even said this: I go to the magazine twice a week. I'm not a Russian-speaking student, and I didn't understand what the student is trying to tell me. So I started asking questions. Well, what kind of place a magazine is? What do you do there? Eventually, we realized that the student wanted to use the word store or a supermarket. Now, can you guess where these mistakes come from? Yes, some of you might be right. It's a language transfer mistake or a first language interference. This occurs when our students tend to rely on the knowledge of their native language, and that's why they're bound to make a mistake. That's why I like to encourage my students to think in English rather than translate word for word from Russian into English. Now, another very important point to understand is fossilization or fossilized mistakes. Some of you may have heard about them, some of you might not. Fossilization is actually our biggest threat, our biggest enemy, and we absolutely want to avoid this. What is fossilization? Well, fossilization is a process when occurs at the very beginning of the learning process. So imagine a student making a mistake, and again and again and again, and the teacher for some reason fails to address or correct this mistake. As the student makes this mistake again and again and again, this mistake gets so deeply ingrained into their mind that later on, it is very hard, almost impossible to get rid of it. I'm sure that you are currently dealing with fossilized mistakes. That is why we have to be very selective. We have to be very careful when we choose which mistakes to focus on. As I've previously mentioned, focus on high frequency mistakes. That's how you will actually avoid fossilization. Don't be afraid to start correcting from a very early, when your student is a new student, when he's starting to learn the language. Focus on high frequency mistakes. It is crucial. Now, another question pops into our minds, and that is when to correct. Can we correct immediately while the student is still speaking, or should we wait until he or she is done speaking? Well, both strategies are fine, but it depends. When we correct mistakes depends on the type of speaking activities. Now that we know that there are several types of speaking activities, let's see which are they. We engage our students in two types of speaking activities. One is speaking for accuracy, and the other one is speaking for fluency. Now, what does accuracy mean? Accuracy means that we're working and we're trying to make our students use some grammar structures correctly or accurately. In this case, linguists agree that we should give immediate correction. This means that, yes, we should interrupt our student in mid-speech or signal that he has just made a mistake. On the other hand, when we engage or involve our students in speaking for fluency, then we're just trying to make the student speak the language as freely as possible, express his ideas or her ideas and opinions. It is generally accepted that teachers should not interrupt students when working for fluency and give delayed correction. This means wait until the student is done speaking and then give some feedback or give some correction. Now, given that we have two different types of speaking activities, how do we correct? How do we signal incorrectness? Let's see. So the first section is speaking for accuracy and ways to show incorrectness immediately on the spot. You can simply say again or say that again, please. This is called repetition or repeating. It's quite easy. Another strategy that you can use is echoing. Some of you might have heard it. Echoing means using your questioning or raising intonation to single out the mistake in a sentence. So you can say this: Flight 39, go to Paris. By raising your intonation with go, you're actually singling it out. That's where the mistake is. And the students will be able to self-correct the mistake. Another third strategy is negotiating the meaning. Imagine your student saying this: yesterday, I will visit a new gallery. Obviously, it is good when you give them options. You can say yesterday or tomorrow. By giving them two alternatives, of course, they will recognize their mistake and do the correction themselves. With more advanced students, let's say upper intermediate and advanced level students, you can use hinting. Hinting means using those grammatical terms that we teachers normally use, like tense, countable, uncountable, adverb, adjective, action verbs, non-action verbs, and so on. You don't have to say anything else but tense or countable or adjective or something like that. Let's take, for example, the sentence Flight 39, go to Paris. You can say tense, meaning change the tense, please. If your student says this, my sister gave me 3 advices, you can simply say uncountable, meaning advice is uncountable. Trust me, more advanced students really get these hints and they self-correct their sentences. We're still dealing with accuracy and giving immediate correction. Imagine your student saying this: she said me I was late. What you can do is just reformulate the sentence and provide the correct alternative. And you can say, oh, you mean she told you you were late. This is called reformulation or recast. However, I urge you to be very careful when using this technique. Why? Well, sometimes our students are so engaged into speaking and they're so eager to speak that they do not pay attention to what we say and instead just keep on talking. That's not really effective. The purpose of correction is that our students understand their mistake and correct it so that it doesn't happen again in future. That's why always make sure that whichever technique you decide to use, make sure that your students understand that you're actually correcting and that they do the correction themselves. If they ignore you, try another technique that might work. Last but not least, and most of all my favorite, is the non-verbal ways that to indicate that something doesn't quite work. Feel free to use mimics and gestures and visual prompts to signal a mistake or to show incorrectness. Trust me, it's quite enjoyable and pleasant to the atmosphere, and the students feel non-threatened. They're okay with it. I have been teaching for a long time, and I have developed my own system of mimics and gestures. For instance, when I do this, my students know immediately that they have to change the tense to past. When I want and expect my students to be using the continuous tense, I do this. This means it's a process, so use continuous form of the verb. When my students make a word order mistake, I do this. This means change the order of the words in the sentence. When it comes to giving on-the-spot correction, you should always tend to correct pronunciation mistakes immediately. Now, we don't have too many options to correct pronunciation except for giving them the right model, the right pronunciation. So you can do that by yourself. You can provide the right model, or you can use the button that we have in the dictionary so that the student can hear the right pronunciation several times. One time would not work, so insist on doing that more times. Now, moving on to ways of showing incorrectness in speaking for fluency activities. We said this requires delayed correction. Of course, if in mid-speech your student feels at a loss for a word, you can give gentle hints or prompts in order to avoid communication to break down. Otherwise, please refrain from interrupting your students. The best possible way to correct and give delayed feedback is to record mistakes in the notes section. Now, you have to pay attention when you do this actually. So my advice to you is to not type full sentences in the notes section. Just type out the part where the mistake is, that part of the sentence. Another thing that I advise you to do is let the student identify and correct mistakes. Thanks God, we've got a lot of options, a lot of features incorporated into the notes section, like underlining the mistake or highlighting it in red or green. So you can explore these options, take advantage in order to be more effective. Now, let's see how this looks like. Here it is. You've got several examples. What I like to do is I like to put a gap where the mistake is, if something is missing, like the sentence, nobody afraid anymore. The student would immediately get that he or she has missed the verb to be. Another thing is to cross out the wrong word and expect that the student would think of the right word, like people, which students immediately get that, yeah, people, I should put who. I also like to highlight the mistakes in red. That's how I signal the mistake, and the students find it easier to identify and self-correct them. So that's what you can do. Also, please bear in mind that when you do this type of correction, delayed, and when you record mistakes in notes, again, don't focus on too many mistakes. Focus again on high frequency mistakes, those mistakes which interfere with communication, and those target language structures that you have studied prior, so not too long ago. Now, we've come to the end of this presentation. Let's summarize. First of all, let me again remind you that correction is a complex process, that it is a multifaceted process, and there are so many factors impacting the way we correct and which approaches we use. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to correction. There is no magic trick or formula that would work best and equally well for all of our students. Don't overdo it, don't underdo it. Try to find the balance. And how do we find the balance? Well, remember the things that we went through previously. So ignore the errors, focus on mistakes, because they are the most annoying because they are recurring, and despite how many times you repeat again, they recur again and again. So try to find a really, really good balance between interaction and correction. Now, once you choose to correct the mistakes, think about the goal of the speaking activity. Is it accuracy? Is it fluency? And also think about the ability of each and every individual students you have. Think about the learning styles. Bear in mind their personalities as well and match your correction accordingly. We have some extrovert students and they do not mind being corrected. But on the other hand, we also have students who are more introvert and they kind of like get very discouraged when we correct them abruptly. So try to find subtle correction techniques that would work well for those. I encourage you to experiment and see what works best for each student you have. Always be prepared and on full alert to adjust the way you correct. As I said, some techniques would work well, but others would not with certain students. That's why adjustments are necessary. And last but not least, be gentle and be supportive. So correction takes time. If we want to eradicate a student mistake, we probably should revise this mistake several times. We should be persistent when it comes to correction. We should point out these kind of mistakes several times before students are eradicated from their speech. And to end this presentation, I would advise you to follow the link in order to complete a short test. This test will actually get you ready for the next step, which is the practical workshop. I hope you found this webinar useful, and I hope that now you have a better understanding on how to choose which mistakes to correct, how much of a correction to do, and how to do it. Thank you so much.